Welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran, and I have a repeat guest with me here again. If you listened in a few weeks back, you'll recall I had Neha from Girls at the Ballpark on to talk a little bit about her journey as a baseball fan and just baseball in general. And as a result of that conversation, Neha has become my go-to baseball person. So we are going to be talking today a little bit about some historical stuff. Pete Rose and Joe Jackson and the 1919 Black Sox have been reinstated for eligibility into the Hall of Fame by decision of baseball commissioner, MLB commissioner Rob Manfred. And I wanted to kind of bring in Neha here to talk a little bit about this development and just kind of break all of that down, because I do think it's a really interesting sports debate that's been going on for a long time. It's like all-time hits leader, he should be in the Hall of Fame. You know, it's been something that people have talked about in bar rooms for years now. So Neha, first of all, thank you again for joining me another time. I'm glad to know I didn't scare you off with my ranting last time. How are you?
No, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be a repeat guest, so I appreciate that. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, so let's dive right in here. So the MLB comes out. Obviously, Pete Rose has passed away, as have the 1919 Black Sox at this point, and he just goes ahead and says, "Oh, we're removing this lifetime ban," and it was really this hard line in the sand for the longest amount of time with MLB. I think more so than other sports, because they're so steeped in integrity and tradition and all this other stuff. So when you saw that report come out, what was your immediate reaction?
I mean, I definitely found it very interesting, especially because I believe that under Rob Manfred, he has banned the most amount of players and personnel in MLB. And he also would continuously reject Pete Rose's request for reinstatement while he was alive. And so the timing of it just seems very odd. I do know that this, presidential administration publicly spoke out about Pete Rose. We also know they speak out about a lot of things that could, don't necessarily have any meaning or value to them specifically, but like to create distractions. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what it was about this particular timing. I think especially when you take into consideration the 1919 team, if this is simply about these guys are no longer around with us, don't see a purpose in keeping the ban on them, then why not do the 1919 team earlier, as opposed to now? So it feels a little like it could be pandering perhaps to the administration or, other pressure from other places. But I just found the whole thing a little bit odd to do now.
From the pandering perspective, I guess, what does MLB have to gain here by doing that? Obviously, they're kind of they're their own organization and all that. By getting in the good graces of the White House, for example, what do they really have to gain? Is there a tangential benefit to them saying, "Hey, we did this good PR move that you guys wanted us to do. Now here's something in return"?
Yeah, I mean, truthfully, I don't see what there is to gain. However, I think as we've kind of seen in general over the last, few weeks, it feels like a lifetime, but it's just been a little over 100 days. Going back to the DEI scrubbing, the scrubbing of Jackie Robinson's legacy, and not really speaking up and out about that, and pushing back. Again, I can't, necessarily specifically state that this is the cause and the reason, but it does create a lot more questions on what exactly are they trying to gain by, making a move like this. And is it to succumb to the pressure that they're receiving from, from the White House? And, is there any benefit? Is there anything to gain around that? And again, I just don't see the answer, at least from this side of things. Of course, we never actually know what's going on, under the surface. But yeah, I really don't see a benefit in this.
To jump on your Jackie Robinson point there, it's kind of like, oh, how convenient is that you're scrubbing the history of a black man who was obviously iconic in baseball, and unscrubbing or the history of a white team and a great white player. And it almost just like, if the shoe fits kind of thing with this administration. It just seems to be a recurring pattern.
Right. The optics are definitely not great.
Yeah, I think the optics are blind at this point, right?
Yeah.
It's just kind of the way that's been going. I guess from your personal perspective, before all this happened, again, like I mentioned at the top, it's kind of been a debate forever. Is like, should Pete Rose be in the Hall of Fame? Do you think that he should have been in the Hall of Fame by now?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm Pete was definitely before my time in
Right.
terms of playing career. And so, quite frankly, it's not something that I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about prior to him being reinstated.
Mm.
Um, Undeniably, being the player who has had the most hits in all of baseball, that's still a record that, is going on to this day. Of course, that is a major accomplishment. It's very likely that if he had not been banned at any point, he would have been a shoo-in to go into the Hall. I think where we stand now, and I think also for me, it is difficult to separate, the numbers from the man and his actions off the field, and that's not even pertaining to just the gambling and the ban and whatnot. I find it very difficult to create an perpetually compelling argument about why he should go in, because I think it's really difficult at this stage to not consider character and to not consider, other off the field actions. And so for me personally, I would not put him in the Hall of Fame. I believe you can note his accolades. I have never been to Cooperstown, so I don't know if that information is already in there. But I think where we stand now and the fact that he was banned to begin with, and it's MLB reinstating him, this is not like a directive that came from the Hall at any point. I just don't see it necessary for him to be in the Hall at this point.
Yeah, I think it's kind of been it's almost made him more famous, I think, him not being in the Hall, right?
Yeah.
It's like, and baseball is such a statistic driven sport that I think that's why that was such a big conversation piece, where it was like, oh, you have the all-time hits leader, and all these records and all that. Be like in basketball or in football, it's like the all-time yardage leader or points leader wasn't in their respective Hall of Fames, right? But I
Right.
think the legend of Rose has kind of been elevated because he's out of there. And I think of all the Hall of Fames, the baseball one is the hardest to get into. I think that's kind of been well acknowledged. And because they take all that stuff into account, it's why guys from the steroid era have been repeatedly off of the ballot and all that. And I guess from your perspective, do you think that the baseball writers, when it comes to Cooperstown, have done a decent enough job to keep that integrity, that moral fiber aspect of it alive and well, or do you think maybe they're starting to see some cracks in the foundation there also?
I mean, unfortunately, I don't think it's so transparent because, to your point, one thing, and going back to Rose specifically, in his case, there have also been so many changes made to how, players will actually even get into the Hall. And with him specifically, and a good I think article to read about this is, from Jason Stark from The Athletic, wrote something last week that really highlights and breaks down exactly the process that Rose would even have to get through in order to make it into the Hall of Fame. Because of his playing time, he is going to be voted upon by the Classic Eras Committee. And the earliest that he could get in would be 2028. And so we're talking about something that's not even going to happen until over 2 years from now. And the committee is not even going to be put together until 2027. And we don't know who that is because those are also elected upon by the Hall of Fame board. And so taking all those factors into consideration, and a good example of, a guy that got in by this committee that has been illustrated to make a point in terms of the stats is Harold Baines, who would not even sniff even close to the percentage to get into the Hall when he was eligible. But in that committee that voted on his year in 2019, was Jerry Reinsdorf, who owned the White Sox, the team that he played for, Tony La Russa, his former manager. And so that really became controversial when he went in. And so they've changed that as well to ensure that whoever is on the committee, which is typically made up of like execs and other Hall of Fame players, generally who have been, who played in the same era or decade as the players under consideration, to make that more equitable for everyone that is going to be involved to participate. So I do believe that, the Hall keeps adjusting and refining based on like the past mistakes or key learnings that have been made. Now, kind of when we look at the present day voting of Hall of Fame, where it's done by, the baseball writers, I look at, situations such as the steroid era group, who at no point, none of those guys were banned from the game of baseball. They were certainly suspended. And, some of them had to go face a grand jury to discuss their usage. But, they've been eligible they weren't eligible when it was time for them to be eligible, and they haven't been voted in. They will receive some votes, but of course they've never gotten the percentage needed to actually get in. So it really comes down to, at this point, I guess where your moral compass lies, as well as where you personally feel that the integrity comes into the question. I think it's just something that's very much more implied based on who each individual is and who they're considering. And so it is a bit of a gray area, because I don't think there is a clear definition. It's kind of left up to, whoever is making the determination for that individual.
Yeah, it's incredibly subjective, right? It's different eras and different qualifications, like you said, like they're refining the process. One thing that I really thought of immediately as soon as I saw the headline come across, like, you have these instant reactions or whatever. My instant reaction was like, oh yeah, I mean, of course they did this now because they're starting to accept all this gambling money. And and so I always thought it was kind of ironic because where there's across leagues, NFL, MLB,
Right.
NBA, whatever, even soccer, same thing. Is they're like, oh, official sportsbook partner of this league, and then it's like, oh, but you also have this guy and this team, in the case of the Black Sox, that were banned because of that same reason. And I just thought, like, yeah, I mean, that FanDuel money was probably really good to make you want to say, well, maybe I should reverse course a little bit here. Do you think that the normalization and the socialization of online sports betting maybe kind of tilted the decision here a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know for sure if that's kind of where the mindset came from, but it does definitely kind of trivialize the the significance of the ban, because obviously in this case it was like the potential that Rose was betting on games that him and his team were playing in,
Mhm.
which could obviously have detrimental outcomes. But I think in general, that's kind of like the joke that everyone makes, right? I think especially even when you look at what happened with, Ipe Mizuhara, Shohei Ohtani's interpreter, uh, although he was not a player, he was employed, by Shohei, he was employed by like the Angels as well as the Dodgers. And, it does call into question though that almost like being hypocritical to a degree that like obviously in his case he was stealing money, so it's a little bit different,
Mhm.
but it does make it hypocritical when all the RSNs are owned by a major betting partner, and the little chyrons and the tickers that scroll by on the TV has different like bets and parlays and all these different things, and you have players themselves who have partnerships with these different organizations that participate in sports betting. And so it's really, like I said, it just becomes a little hypocritical, kind of dilutes banning someone over the premise of betting. The minutia of it, sure, I understand, but it does make that line a little less, a little more blurred, I would say, when coming to making these decisions and these types of announcements and putting down like punishments and bans and things like that.
Yeah, like every sport has had to deal with this now. The NBA banned Jonte Porter for betting on his own prop lines. The NFL suspended Calvin Ridley for a year for hitting some parlays when he was on the injured reserve list. And obviously, you mentioned the Otani debacle, I guess you could call it. And it's just they're trying to find this line because on one hand, they're co-opting these companies to market this. I wrote an article about this months ago, how it feels like cigarette ads in the 40s.
Hmm.
And where it's just like, oh man, look at this sex appeal, look at these testimonials, everything's
Right.
awesome. This is so cool. You can win all this money. And the leagues are signing off on it because every single ad will be like official sportsbook partner of this league. And by extension, the leagues are saying, yeah, this is good. This is normalized. This is just like buying Gatorade with Michael Jordan on the bottle, right? Same
Right.
thing. On the flip side, you have players who are just consuming this like consumers,
Right.
right? And you wonder like what's the line? And I think there is a correlation here because if you're going to be saying betting is good, betting's exciting, betting enhances the game, you're going to have like even at stadiums they have different types of betting hooks and all that, and then you get all these different like same game stuff, inning props, whatever. How are you going to just say, all right, well, we got to keep this ban upheld, now, and I guess maybe the line is don't bet on the games you play in, maybe
Right.
which is why Jonte Porter was
Right.
banned for like by the NBA, and Calvin Ridley was only suspended because he wasn't playing, and I just wonder what if this enforcement is going to get more and more murky as time goes on, then the line becomes more and more blurred because, like you said, these companies aren't going away. FanDuel has the rights to RSN.
Right.
Every single bottom line ticker, like you said, has a live lineup in the middle of broadcast. Like, oh, it started at this point spread, and now it's
Right.
at this point spread. And it's one of the problems I have with this injection of it, especially in baseball, because again, it's the legacy integrity sport, right?
Right.
Like this is a game that's like is all about honor, tradition, all this stuff more so than basketball or football ever will be because baseball's been around since the 1800s,
Right.
and it's kind of like I just wonder how does a league really reason with that, right? Because on one hand, you got to take the sponsorship because
Right.
they're giving the money. You're going to do it as a league, but at the same time, does your integrity kind of your whole varnish of integrity does that kind of just go away? I mean, what's your feel on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of like the issue when it comes to these kinds of discussions, with the leagues is that, there is some validity in that, yes, we're all adults here. There are certain rules that, you need to abide by. But at what point also do the leagues take accountability in being facilitators, you know? And so it just seems like that there is no accountability on that front that, we think you should not be betting. Yeah, you should be following the rules. You should be doing all these things, but also we're just going to constantly throw at you betting, betting, betting. You
Mhm.
know, like obviously, MLB was not going to turn down or do anything about the fact that FanDuel took over, Bally Sports, which ironically also, is a casino company, but it betting and parlays and that sort of thing was never really a thing when they were kind of taking over. So I think it's very difficult for them to have any say in that, in the fact that they are now broadcasting, majority of the teams that play in the league. But I think it really comes down to just a lot more accountability in each league's part. Because like I said, it's like it is much more like facilitating. It's like they're taking the money, they're bombarding you completely with all these numbers and all these things, and it's not just in the broadcast, it's on the social media, it's you can literally turn nowhere and not see any of those types of numbers. So what are they doing though to kind of like take some of that accountability, and not be so much of as like enablers,
Mhm.
to the not only to their own constituents but to the general public as well. Aside from, here's a disclaimer that, if you have a gambling problem, please call. I just don't think And I also think part of it is that they just never anticipated for that. And so there's just nothing in place in any sort of guidelines or practices, to kind of go about dealing with this sort of thing.
Go into the steroid era conversation we kind of had earlier. So obviously the league has opened it up now for these two entities with Rose and the Black Sox to be into, or at least recognized on the Hall of Fame level. And it does open the question of how long before these people are embracing of the steroid era guys. And I think that's more of a question about the baseball writers that vote on this stuff. And like you said, because they never had a ban, right? They had suspensions, but not bans. And do you see a world where eventually generations go by and maybe Clemens, Bonds, Palmeiro, these guys pass away, and people say, you know what, in like 2050, 2060, and they're like, you know what, was it really that bad? And should we just let them in? Do you see a path where that is the reality?
Yeah, I mean, I hope it doesn't get to that, because I do think like a guy like Barry Bonds, who is, was a phenomenal player even before,
Yeah.
the steroids came into play, is a guy that should be in the Hall of Fame. That's my personal take. I know a lot of other people feel that way. And look, he's beloved by the San Francisco Giants. He's there all the time, part of their ceremonies and celebrations. He's definitely not someone who, I think overall even like the league is shunning, or anything like that. It really just comes down to, how the voters have felt. And I feel that it has been too big for them to ignore. One thing I will say that, that came up in the arguments about Rose, and I kind of held a similar argument in terms of the steroid era guys, is that you can't, unless they were able to investigate specifically, there was no way to find out or tell if there was any correlation in the bets that Rose made, if they specifically impacted the outcomes of the games that he bet on. And it's kind of a similar thing with the steroids, is that yes, someone could, have taken them, they did take them, but there's no way to know what kind of actual impact it had on their ability to play the game. If there were specific outcomes for any specific game type of thing, it's very murky. And so it really just comes down to a game of like, well, where does your convictions lie, and like your moral compass and that sort of thing. Because again, they weren't banned. Everyone has been eligible to be on the ballot. Many people haven't made it in. And, there's also a guy like David Ortiz where he did appear on a list, and there were allegations and accusations of, him having used PEDs. And, but in his case, he never had to go in front of a jury or anything like that. And for the most part, there hasn't been anything shown that, he participated in that outside of these allegations. And I don't believe that they were even able to see like any of like the actual evidence or reporting based on that. And, he's been in the Hall of Fame. And so I think, again, it just kind of really comes down to, the separation of like the player and, his actions, and where do writers, land on that when they're, coming to these decisions. Because there are writers that, as of like the most recent voting, they are placing votes for those guys. The other thing that comes into play is that you're also going to get other guys on the ballot constantly.
Right.
And then you have to make that decision on, where are your votes going to be split up against those guys. And it's like, are you going to go for the ones first that, as far as played a clean, career? So I would hope that it doesn't necessarily come to that, where it's like these guys are being honored, after they're no longer with us. I do think it is a bit of a different situation than like the Pete Rose and the 1919 Black Sox. So I certainly hope it doesn't necessarily come to that, but I feel like that's probably kind of more of the direction we're headed. For me, it's always kind of been, if you're going to vote these guys in, you got to call it just as it is. In the same way they called it the asterisk era, they can be in there, but there should be additional information to say that, this is, kind of like what happened during this time period, that they were, found to be taking PEDs, stood in front of a grand jury, that sort of thing. I think the problem with all of this is that everything becomes a slippery slope, right?
Right.
Because it's like, if you let those guys in and give additional context to why they're in there, now you have to open yourselves up to kind of any possible type of like example of an individual or player that perhaps could not get in 100% on their merits and kind of who they are as an individual. So I think that's kind of a little bit of what we also see, is that it just kind of opens up a bigger door to other conversations that maybe, not everyone is interested in having down the line.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing with all those players because a lot of them have now gotten into their second careers, which is whether it's broadcasting, coaching, whatever it is that they're getting into. Like I think about a guy like Alex Rodriguez, who's,
Mhm.
reestablished himself as like a pretty good broadcaster, and now he's part owner of a basketball team as well, and he's kind of had this second career. And I think about when I was growing up. So I'm in my late 30s now, so I grew up watching baseball in the 90s and in the late 90s, and the big draw then was of course the home run races,
Right.
with McGuire and Sosa and eventually Bonds, and that rejuvenated the sport. And I've always felt a certain way because I do agree with your asterisk point, because I am a firm believer that those guys kind of saved what baseball was at the time,
Right.
coming out of the lockout and all that, and the missed World Series in the middle of the 90s. It's just the sport was in a really bad place. Like people think it's in a bad place now. It was in a
Mhm.
really bad place then. And those guys, they kind of piqued national interest. You would turn on Sports Center and they're like, "Oh, did Sosa hit one today?" And that was
Right.
the whole thing. And I think that's a big part of baseball's story. And I think the best stories are the ones that make you have conflicting emotions,
Mhm.
right? And I think to say like, "Hey, he hit these many home runs. Oh, underneath, by the way, this was during an era, blah blah blah, found guilty of using whatever." And I think the kind of keeping them out thing is more of trying to preserve the purity of baseball.
Mhm.
When I think most of these sports, especially when you go as far back as baseball does, have never been pure, you
Right.
know, and like every single sport on some level has had to deal with drug problems, has had to deal with racial issues, has had to deal with domestic violence issues, and name me a league and I could tell you they have those issues, and that's just the reality of the situation. It's
100%.
yeah, and it's like you talk about like Jackie Robinson and what other early black players had to deal with. That's part of the story. It's an ugly side of baseball story. It's
Mhm.
not all roses. There was a lot of trials and tribulations that he went through, and I think that's also part of the trials and tribulations of the league. And I think sometimes baseball writers, they get a little bit too philosophical and
Yeah.
too, let's maintain the purity of the game. Like, yes, you should maintain the purity of the game, but also acknowledge, a guy like Bonds is the best example because he was a Hall of Famer before PEDs. You
100%.
know, like he was one of the best ever before
Right.
PEDs.
Yeah.
And if you're going to do it for one guy, it would probably be him, maybe Clemens as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just an insane thing, and I think we're gonna be moving towards that point.
Yeah. I
Um,
think it also, but I think again, I think that illustrates like the larger point and how all of these things are tied together.
yeah.
Same thing with the betting is like, well, when all that stuff was going on and these guys were playing out of their minds, like Major League Baseball certainly benefited from it. And now, they're trying to keep these guys out. It's the same
Mhm.
thing, I think, with all this betting stuff too, is like, well, MLB is certainly, all these leagues are certainly benefiting from it. While in the same breath creating, ostracizing, the players that have like participated in it or helped them to kind of get to that level. So and like you said, every league has this problem, especially because I am so like, into baseball and been here for this time period, the steroid era, and now beyond. I think that's kind of like been one of the biggest issues, especially with Major League Baseball, is that it is so murky and it is so blurred across so many lines, but they continue to benefit from it while kind of, condemning a lot of these things at the same time.
I mean, again, I'm always gonna default back to something basketball related, but like there's guys who did cocaine in the 80s who are in the Hall of Fame. You know, like let's be honest here. And to me, like I think this is maybe just a personal thing and another weird analogy from me, but like when I would watch like the Marvel superhero movies, right? Like I always couldn't stand Captain America because he was too perfect, right? He was like his moral compass was always 100 out of 100, and there's like all this stuff that really had traction in the 40s and 50s when he was created in the comic book world. But the reason I always liked Iron Man was because he's incredibly flawed as an individual. It's like he has a lot of issues, and the story is you overcome the issues to do whatever. And I think that's a more interesting story to tell than let's just only highlight the pristine stuff that shows the goodness of the game. Let's have smooth edges only. Like, I like a little jagged edge every now and then, right?
Right.
A bad R&B reference there, I guess. But but yeah, it's like I think that baseball should embrace that. Football has, basketball has, soccer has. It's the WNBA does. And it's just like I think there's something good about that, and not just having this whole clean cut look all the way across. I think the Otani scandal from last year makes him more interesting. He's
like, already very interesting.
It's already very interesting. It makes it even more interesting. Why would I want somebody less interesting? Is my overall point. Neha, I can't have you on here without getting your kind of reactions on the way the season's gone so far. So we're kind of really trudging through it here. Any surprises or something that's really kind of stood out to you so far this year?
Yeah, I mean, the Mariners have done really well right now. I think that's come as a bit of a surprise considering that they didn't really do much to add to their offense in the offseason, and the laurels have really rested on, their young pitching staff. But right now that staff, half of them have been on the IL, throughout this start of the season. So admittedly, the AL West, I would say, is significantly weaker than some of the other divisions out there. But I think they've been a nice surprise. I say nice loosely just because my Angels are also in the AL West, which I guess we can add to the surprise that they just swept a 3-game series at Dodger Stadium versus the Dodgers and are the only team to do so this season against them. So that's pretty exciting. And the Orioles, to a degree, it's not shocking because, they did not add on to their pitching in the offseason. They let Corbin Burns go to the Diamondbacks. But I don't think anyone expected them to be this bad and, have their manager fired by the middle of May. So I think that's really been shocking, just how much of a fall off, that team has been. So and the Tigers. I expected them to be competitive, but I don't think anyone expected it to go this much this soon. So I will be really interested in seeing, if they're able to sustain that. Again, I do feel like the AL Central is fairly competitive, but there is a lot of, I guess, volatility in that division as well with some of the other teams, such as the Guardians and the Royals. So I will be interested in seeing, if they can kind of carry this all the way through the end.
As you may know, I lived in Detroit for many years, and so I still have a lot of friends who are big Tigers fans, obviously Detroit sports fans, and they just ranting and raving. As soon as the Pistons were eliminated from the playoffs, they just jumped right into Tigers mode, and it continues to fuel my sad reality, which is as soon as I left living in Detroit, all the sports teams got good.
You were the problem, is what you're
I was
saying.
definitely the problem. I mean, you really look at it, the Pistons make the playoffs for the first time in a decade. The Lions finally become good in the NFL. The Tigers are top of the division, made the playoffs last year. And then you also had Michigan win the college football national championship. I mean, it's it's not. I'm never beating those allegations, Neha. So but I'm happy for them. they
So
have a young.
also why Javier Baez is having a finally like a career renaissance turnaround after moving to center field after just not cutting it for the first several seasons with the Tigers.
Yeah, and it's just it's something that the city really gets fired up about. I think they get the most fired up when the Lions are great, which
Yeah.
we saw last NFL season.
Yeah.
But a close second, I think, is when the Tigers are doing great as well. They really love baseball there, so always love to see that. And although don't love to see those super cold October playoff games, or September playoff games down in Comerica, but you got to adapt. But Neha, as always, thank you so much for joining me. You all can follow her on Instagram and Threads at Girls at the Ballpark, and I highly recommend you do so for a lot of great commentary about the sport of baseball and MLB. So, Neha, thank you again for joining me. Thank you, everybody, for listening to another episode of the podcast. You could catch us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Video of this podcast is on Spotify if you are so inclined to see two people just yapping into a camera for about 35 minutes. So, Neha, thanks again. And we will see everybody next time.